Ready? Morning and welcome to today's meeting. I would like to officially open the meeting of the Outer Development Assessment Panel for today at 9:31 a.m. I would like to acknowledge we are hosting this meeting on the traditional land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We acknowledge the Aboriginal people, traditional custodians of Australia. Pay respects to elders past and present, the ongoing connection between people, land, waters and community. This meeting will be run in accordance with the DAP Standing Orders 2024 under the Planning and Development DAP Regulations 2011. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the DAP website in accordance with Regulation 42A of the Planning and Development DAP Regulations 2011. Panel members may refer to technical devices throughout the meeting to assist them with the information. We have two items on today's agenda. They are separated into two parts. I will introduce the members present on the panel. Online for part B, we have Mayor Margaret Thomas. Good morning. And we have Councillor Kathy Ritchie. Good morning to both of you. In the room, we have to my right, Dale Page, Deputy Presiding Member. To my left, Mike Moritz, Specialist Member. And my name is Francesca Lafanti, Presiding Member. For part C, we'll be changing our local government members and we will be joined by Dr. Caroline Wheelinger and Councillor Michael Hancock. There are no apologies for today's meeting and there are no members on leave of absence. Minutes for this meeting will be available on the DAP website. We will move forward to part B, the items dealing with the City of Kalamunda. Members, can I have a show of hands that you've duly considered all matters relating to Part B, including material from the applicant and the published R13? That is unanimous for the minute taker. Members, are there any disclosures of interest? And I will ask at the same time if this meeting, to the councillors present, if this matter was considered by a council meeting at all, and whether or not there's any interests as a result of that. I'll hand over first to the councillors.
Disclosure of interest? No.
Thank you. Thank you. And did this go to a council meeting at all, this item?
No. No.
Thank you. Members, are there any other disclosures of interest relating to Part B? That is nil for the minute taker. We will now move through to the item. There is one item, item 3.1, Abernathy Road and Port Place, High Wycombe, warehouse, storage, light industrial and incidental office. We do have one presenter for today's meeting, Mr. Lex Barnett. And as you are aware, in accordance with the DAP Standing Orders 2024, Clause 4282, your presentation is limited to 3 minutes. No time extension has been granted. We have with us DAP Secretariat and they will assist me in the timing of the presentation. You're encouraged to focus on the main aspects, and as you have heard, all presenters have received your material and have acknowledged that they have read and are aware of the material. I will hand over to yourself.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the members of the panel.
Sorry, you might need to speak just a fraction louder.
Thank you. And I will keep this very brief. I have read all of the material provided to us, and it is fair to say that this is a fairly straightforward application. It is compliant with planning requirements for the most part, and hence the recommendation for approval. We support. We've read the substantive report as well, and we're supportive and agree with all of that. The only issue that we did have was in the framing of condition 18, which had stipulated a maximum height of structures of 0.2 metres or 39.3 metres AHD, and that had inadvertently included this drop tower structure, which needed a greater height and was always shown as such. Now that issue has since been dealt with through the DAP query and response dated 2025, and we've also seen that material as well. So with that change recommended by the responsible authority in response to that query, and given that change is also supported by Perth Airports, we are supportive of the overall recommendation with that change included. So the main purpose really for appearing today was to ensure that there aren't any lingering questions from the panel in relation to that particular aspect, or any other aspect for that matter, but just to ensure that there are no concerns from the panel about this change, because it is a relatively minor component of the overall development, but it is an important one, and so getting that right is a success. That's all I have to say, and I'm just available for any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Panel members, are there any questions? I will first go to panel members online. Do you have any questions to this presenter?
Not from me. No.
Thank you. Panel members, do you have any other questions to this presenter?
I have one, and it might end up being for the city officers, but I'll put it to you first, Lex. So it's about the bushfire management plan. So is this application lodged during the transition period for application of the new regs or before?
That is a really good question. And I believe it was during the transition phase, but I couldn't say that categorically. I'm hoping that the officers might be able to.
Okay, I'll direct it to them then. Is it your intent, because there's an advice note that you might need to provide a bushfire management plan, is it your intent to prepare one ahead of a building permit? Or
It is.
who determines that? Whether it's required, is that the city or is that?
I would have thought, well, if it's not as a condition through this approval, would be a requirement of the city.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Sorry for being vague.
That's all good. Thanks.
Thank you. If there's no other questions at this juncture, thank you very much for your presentation. We will now move to the officers of the city, and we have listed here Shikara McQuaid and Cardia Marinia, and I don't know if I've pronounced those correct, and you might want to correct the pronunciation.
Hello, thank you for your question. Yes, Shakira McQuaid and Cardia Mariani. To answer the question about the bushfire, it was lodged during the transition period, noting that the 4-month period ends on the 24th of January, so being tomorrow. The bushfire assessment didn't form part of this application. However, an advice note was put on because when they apply for building permit, they may be subject to build it to a particular BAU rating at that time. So that's why that advice note was added on.
Have you got any further comments officers would like to make before we go to questions?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to questions. You have a follow-up question, would you like to?
Thank you, presiding member. So just as a follow-up, will it be the city then that determines at building permit stage whether or not a bushfire management plan is required or not? I'm just mindful when the building permit is lodged, you've got your 10 days to do it, and I know that you can stop the clock and so on, but will the applicant be made aware ahead of lodging the building permit that it'll be required, or once they've prepared their building permit, are you going to put a hold on it and then ask them to do one? What's the process from your point of view?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's a good question. We obviously haven't come across this before, so it's a new one. I think that we would request it when the building permit comes in. We can put it on hold and request that the bushfire management plan is submitted to our satisfaction.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Yes, thank you, presiding member. So advice note I is a duplicate of advice note G. Are you happy for advice note G to be deleted administratively? I think the duplicated I is worded slightly different and a little better in my view. Are you happy for one to be deleted administratively?
Yes, we are happy for one of those to be deleted. Yeah. And acknowledge the double up.
Thank you. In considering the traffic impacts of the proposal, DPLH have suggested that trip generation for the office space be separated out for the overall space. But you haven't reported it on that way. Could you comment on that for me, please?
One moment, please.
That's okay.
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question, please?
So somewhere in the report and attachments, I noted that DPLH suggested, because they did their assessment and provided some comments, they suggested that the trip generation for the office space needed to be separated out of the calculation for the overall space. And it looks like you've calculated it in your report, probably because it's an ancillary or an incidental component to the warehouse. It doesn't seem that you've done that. Could you just confirm why that is so?
Thank you for your question. Did you mean the car parking calculation or the trip generation using
trip generation?
Thank you for your question. Because we deemed that it was an incidental use to the warehouse, we didn't see a need for that to be assessed in that way.
Thank you. I thought that might be the case. I just needed you to confirm that for me. And then very last, I think your report talks about a parking shortfall of 16 bays. I don't think it matters because the justification you've provided for the shortfall is the same, whatever it is, but I think it's 18 bays. That is the actual shortfall. Is that correct? So on page 16, you've got your calculation.
It is 18 bays, sorry, that would have been a typo.
That's all good. Thank you. That's all from the presiding member.
Thank you. Are there any questions to officers of the city at this point from panel members? If there are no further questions from panel members, we move back to the agenda. There is a recommendation at the beginning of the agenda. There's an R13 relating to one of the conditions, condition 18. I'm going to ask for a mover of the recommendation as written in the beginning of the RA. Is there a mover of the RA recommendation?
It is Thomas.
Moved, thank you. Mayor Thomas. Is there a seconder for the RA recommendation? It is seconded, Mike Moritz. Would the mover like to speak to the item?
Thank you very much. We believe this is the right building in the right place. We believe the 18 conditions cover everything, things like lighting management, construction management plan, the landscape plan. We're happy with all that. We're happy with the minimum of 22 shade trees. We think that's really important. The changing of the wording for 18 is acceptable to the city. It's what we originally had and it's been looked at by the airport. So we're very comfortable with that, as is the applicant. We understand there's 18 parking bays short. However, there are only 50 staff and we think the shortage of 18 bays is acceptable. There are 9 advice notes which cover everything else. So all in all, we just think this is a really good building. and we urge the panel to support it.
Thank you, member. You did refer to condition 18. What was moved onto the table was the RA as written. Can I clarify that you are at this juncture moving amendment 1, which is a modification to condition 18 as per the R13 wording?
Yes, I am moving this with that change, that amendment.
With the amendment to condition 18. Is the seconder in agreement that's being moved with the condition? Thank you for that clarification. Would the seconder like to speak to the motion inclusive of modified condition 18?
I'm highly supportive of the project. I think there's been a thorough assessment undertaken and clarifying that matter around condition 18, and this conversation about the car parking satisfies me that it's an appropriate use of the site, and happy to support the application.
Thank you. Are there any speakers against the proposal? Are there any other speakers for the proposal?
Very briefly, presiding member.
Yes.
I'm happy also to support the proposal. Permitted use under the scheme meets the objectives and provisions of both the general and light industry zones, also complies with the intent for the build form under the LDP applicable to the site. Minor plot variation being sought, but when looked at in conjunction with site coverage, it's really inconsequential. There's parking shortfall, but based on the analysis of the actual use proposed and the analysis and justification provided in the report is very solid. I'm comfortable that there won't be a shortfall or a problem in real terms. So happy to support. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers on this proposal? If not, we move back to the mover for right of reply.
Sorry, just repeat. What you said.
You're on mute. You were on mute, so just let her.
Oh, sorry, well, I didn't realise I was on mute. I have nothing to add, presiding member, in a right of reply.
Thank you. Right of reply has been had. Members, we are going to the vote of the recommendation inclusive of modification to condition 18. All those in favour? It is carried unanimously for the minute taker. There are no Form 2 applications and there are no SAT reconsiderations. I'd like to thank Mayor Thomas and Councillor Ritchie of the City of Kalamunda for their attendance and participation. Time is now 9:48 a.m. and we will be saying goodbye to those two members and welcome to our other members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Caroline Willinger. Is that how I pronounce it? Great. And I'd also
thank you, that's fine.
Thank you. And I'd also like to welcome Councillor Michael Handcock. Thank you. Time, as I've indicated, is now 9:49 and we are now moving to part C of the agenda. Welcome to our two new councillor members who are joining the panel. And I would like to have a show of hands that you have duly considered all matters, a declaration of consideration on all matters in relation to part C, and that's including the R13 direction material that was submitted. That is unanimous for the minute taker. Members, are there any disclosures of interest? And in that, I'll first go to members online and I'll ask whether or not this matter was considered by a council meeting and there's associated disclosure.
No, no declarations of interest and not considered by council.
Thank you for that. We'll now be moving forward to item 3.1, Alex Wood Drive in Forestdale. We do have two presenters. There has been a request for additional time which has been provided to Mr. Clayton Plug for the first presentation, and I'd like to announce that in accordance with DAP Standing Orders 2024, clause 4.8.2, generally presentations are limited, but as I've already indicated, there has been an extension of time granted for the first presenter, and presenters are encouraged to focus on the main aspects in their verbal presentation for the panel. We do have with us the DAP Secretariat will assist in the timing of these presentations. I'll move first to the presentations as provided. First, Mr. Clayton Plug, and then Mr. Scott Lambie. Over to yourselves.
Thank you, presiding member, and good morning, panel members. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning, as well as the granting of the time extension. I'll do my best to stick well within that. So just as an overall start, I'd like to set the context here, as I've done in my written deputation. The client's been involved in the development of the Forestdale Business Park for over 20 years. They've been waiting all this time for the right time to develop the land holdings within it. And it's important to note that this represents the first substantial development of their land holdings, but it's only really around 5% of their total land holding. And so it's important from their perspective to get the development right here, certainly not least from a commercial perspective. So it is really in their interests to ensure that this design is well thought out and prepared. And to that end, extensive consultation has occurred in the design phase of this development, certainly with local agents, but also with some of the larger CBD commercial agents, including the likes of Colliers, Burgess Rawson and JLL, as well as with commercial builders. And they've also undertaken site tours of similar sized warehouse facilities in similar contexts to ensure that what they're proposing here is appropriate and a very robust development. And so in that regard, I'd just like to deal with the main issue that I gather from the city's RAR in respect of parking supply. And to that end, I note that in November last year, as the panel members will be aware, the WAPC released the non-residential car parking rates manual. And in respect of industrial development rates in that manual, it identifies warehouse as a discretionary land use. And it notes that the parking rates for these must be determined on the basis of scale or anticipated demand to the accommodated business operations. And notably, the Metro Outer DAP, has approved several warehouses in recent times in the last few months in outer metropolitan suburbs with technical shortfalls of 70% or more to the parking. And I take it in applying this principle. And it's also been done in some cases where the final tenant was not yet known, as is the case here. And so in this particular case, based on the above commercial intelligence that our client has gathered, and also the technical analysis, which Scott Lambie will delve into in his presentation, our client has striven to ensure that the development provides what it needs in accordance with this policy. The robust market research has been very clear, and they've also already courted and are aware of many potential tenants seeking spaces that or spaces of this warehouse size, which will also be able to comfortably be accommodated in terms of the proposed parking bays as well. And I'd just like to also note it's just not really in our client's interests to have a parking problem after the commencement of a lease. It would create amenity issues which impact the development of their surrounding land holdings. It would obviously create compliance headaches with the city. So why would they design a facility that would create such an issue? Similar to other major industrial developers that have been before this DAP recently, they will vet tenants, of which there are many potentials, as I noted above, just to ensure that their parking needs can be accommodated. And this would be in accordance with the city's proposed condition number 9, which states that no parking should occur in addition to those bays provided on site. And of course, if there was an issue, the city could undertake compliance action in accordance with that proposed condition as well. Finally, on the parking matter, I'd just like to address the 11 bays that have been subject of some conjecture, as we've seen in the R13 notice. Those 11 bays, after I received that yesterday afternoon, we did look into that further, and it appears that our engineer has uncovered a clerical issue at the city's end. The city have acknowledged receipt of engineering plans that showed those 11 bays, but unfortunately, when they issued the stamped approval for those 11 bays, they put the wrong drawing numbers on the approval. And so it's just a clerical issue which they're seeking to resolve now. And so we don't necessarily need those 11 bays as I've outlined, but if there are concerns from any of the panel members about parking, if they still remain, you can be assured that those 11 bays will be constructed. It's definitely our client's intent to do so, and they'll form part of the revised approved drawings once that clerical issue has been resolved. Just briefly moving on to the other matters that the city have listed in their reasons for refusal in the RAR. Firstly, in respect of the design of the facility, it's our firm view that the proposed condition 8, combined with the landscaping outcomes that our client is intent on achieving, provides assurance that the facility will not have eastern and western elevations that are inappropriate. And I think the only point of contention that we have at this stage really is any notion of the use of additional glazing on those elevations. We don't believe that that's warranted. There already is some glazing on those elevations, and there are other opportunities, as panel members would be well aware, to break up masses of facades using different textures and materials, and well as through the provision of landscaping, which our client has committed to, including through the use of things like semi-mature trees, as I noted in my written deputation. Just moving on to...
Clayton, you will need to wrap up very quickly.
Yes, I understand
we
that,
are
yes.
now beyond the additional time frame.
Okay, I've got us at 5.5, but that's okay. I'll do that quickly. Landscaping was the final one that I wanted to address. That I did look into that this morning, and because I was a bit confused about the comments in respect of the landscaping strip not being wide enough. I've triple checked the plans, and I can confirm that we've got at least 3 metres all the way around the car parking areas, other than of course at the crossover locations. And on the sides of the eastern and western elevations, we've actually got 6 and more metres of landscaping. So I don't believe there's any issue with the landscaping that's been proposed. And so on that basis, I would suggest that the panel shouldn't be concerned about that either. But of course, welcome any questions on that or any other matter, including the condition changes I'd suggested. Obviously, we stand by those as well. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, and wish you all the best in determining this application.
Thank you for your presentation. Panel members, do you have any questions from this first presenter? You can come back at the later point after we've had our second presentation, but is there any questions at this juncture?
Yes, thank you, Presiding Member. Just a few, Clayton, if you don't mind. So on page 11 of the report, it states that you have advised the city that the tenants are currently unknown, and it's for that reason that you propose to leave some design detail until you have a tenant. Are you planning on having tenants locked in before you lodge your building application?
I believe that, so in discussion with the client around this, that it's for warehouses of this size, it's difficult to have tenants locked in before all of that, just given the commercial nature of things. So I don't believe that will necessarily be the case. I think that you typically, for warehouses of this size, need to construct them, and then you know, the market can review the built product. But yeah, as I've noted throughout, we're very confident that tenants will be lining up, hopefully, to rent this space, given the commercial research that's gone into ensuring it's very robust for all kinds of different warehouse tenants.
Thank you. You would be aware a Reg 13 request was made for an alternate recommendation to defer the application.
Yes.
To allow you to go and work on some of the issues raised in the report. What are your thoughts, assuming for a minute that the alternate for approval does not get up? What are your thoughts on a deferral to allow you to visit some of those issues previously raised rather than refusal? Yeah,
I suppose we very much stand by the provision of parking bays on this one. And so does our client. We are of the firm view, as outlined, and as Scott will also go into in his presentation, that there's enough provided. And so provided that the deferral doesn't seek to deal with that issue, which I understand is probably the more substantive one from the city's perspective, I guess we'd consider that. But our preference is for a determination to be made, given that we firmly do believe that this is an appropriate development for this location.
Okay, and that's where I think into my last question. Is it even possible to provide all the parking required by Schedule 7A of this scheme and still retain separation of car and truck movements? Or is it not possible?
That certainly was something that we looked at in detail. As you know, we'd initially provided more bays. And all of that does is it just creates issues around the vehicle movements. I suppose on a technical basis, it would be possible to do it because, yeah, you can simply limit all the uses to the rear of the truck movements to the rear of the facility. But what it does to the design means that it's much more favourable when you have these expanses at the front for trucks to be able to get in and out of it at the front. So I guess, strictly speaking, it is possible to separate the two, but we don't think it's warranted, obviously.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from panel members to this presenter? Thank you. If there's no further questions, you can always come back. We will now go to our second presenter, Scott Lambie.
Good morning, panel. Apologies, I'm actually working remotely at the moment and can't seem to get my camera to work, so apologies for that. Yeah, good morning. PTG was engaged to undertake a parking needs study for the development. And the aim of the study was to investigate the expected parking needs and against the statutory parking requirements for similar metropolitan local governments, as well as established parking guidelines such as RTA in New South Wales and ITE. Now, the RTA and ITE guides are of particular interest as the rates within the guides are based on comprehensive surveys of existing established warehouses, not high turnover retail use, that are routinely updated at a regular frequency. And I believe both the guides have been updated in the last couple of years. The RTA guide parking rate for a warehouse is more than 80% lower than the City of Armadale statutory rate, whereas the ITE rate is more than 75% lower. Now, the parking rates for the City of Armadale are from the Town Planning Scheme number 4, which was last updated in November 2005. So it's now 20 years old, as opposed to the RTA and ITE guides that are only a couple of years old. Now, over the years, Warehouse Direct Retail have sought out warehouse sites, and it's understandable that the city may be worried about mid to high intensity retail being undertaken out of such sites. However, requiring a parking rate much higher than necessary for industrial warehouse needs becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the higher parking supply will often attract that type of retail tenant. And that is what we're trying to avoid in this particular location. We're trying to ensure that the site is used for the typical industrial warehouse use. The proposed car parking provision for each tenancy is 15 bays, so 45 bays for light vehicles across the 3 tenancies. While the proposed provision does not satisfy the city's statutory parking demand based on the site area, it is largely in line with the car parking demand assessment based on staff numbers and peak hour trips, which suggests an expected peak car parking demand of around 15 bays per tenancy. Now, it was noted that the city made a comment about the plans for the site showing a trade desk. However, it's our belief that this is just architectural license and diagrammatic only, much like you would see in a house plan, which shows diagrammatic furniture layout. You know, obviously, when you buy the house, there is no requirement for you to obviously put the furniture in those sorts of positions. So it's basically just a demonstration on how the warehouse could in fact be fitted out.
You will need to start to wrap your presentation. Your time limit is now, you've now passed.
Okay, just one more point, if I may. There was also comments made in the RAR that the site is not serviced by public transport, but it is noted that bus route 529 runs down Armadale Road, which is only a short walk from the site. And during the peak hour periods, it does service the stop near Alexwood Drive every 15 minutes. So I believe public transport would be a viable option for any staff or visitors to the site if they chose to do so. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Panel members, do you have any questions to our second presenter? Yes, we're going to member Caroline Willinger.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So my question was, if it was meant to be the neighbouring local governments, the City of Gosnell's one of our major local governments, wasn't included in the analyses, and I was wondering why that was the case. And am I clear in understanding that the ITE standards are from America?
That is correct. ITE is based on American collected data. RTA is based in New South Wales. However, both RTA and ITE are well-established technical documents that are used by the Department of Planning and many local governments within Western Australia. Why City of Gosnells was not used, I am not sure. It was either a case of they didn't have a specific parking rate for industrial warehouses, or it could just be that their rate was exactly the same as City of Armadale's. But I can't confirm that.
Thank you. Do you have further questions if you'd like to continue?
Yeah, well, yes, it was a problem though with constructing all the averages. If you don't use the relevant comparisons, you come up with averages that might suit to fit. And so I had some concern with how the methods for this actual study were constructed. The ITE from America clearly has standards that are acceptable maybe to the applicant, but they're not local standards. And so I have some concerns about why some of the locals weren't included.
You have a comment or a response to that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there's no definitive study for this type of thing available in Western Australia using Western Australian data. So traffic engineers generally seek out what they can find and provides high levels of rigor as far as the data is collected. ITE will actually often, with regards to traffic generation and parking requirements, will actually represent a higher requirement than typically seen in Australia, because the US is quite sort of private vehicle based. So generally, ITE is actually quite robust when used as an assessment against Australian conditions. Yeah, it wasn't in the parking study. It wasn't so much a case of averaging out the parking requirements for different local governments. It was more a case of direct comparison. And for example, in the City of Armadale parking requirements, a winery has the same parking requirements per 100 square metres as a warehouse. A trade display, which would actually generate customers and sort of retail-based activity, also has exactly the same parking requirement as a warehouse. So the point of the study was to show that the parking requirements for warehouses under the City of Armadale town planning scheme appears to be much higher than would typically be found. And if I can give one example, I mean, I'm happy if you want me to stop talking. But as part of a previous company I worked for, we undertook a parking study for an established warehouse development in the city of Wanneroo. And the name of that business was Clean International, and it was located at 36 Hemisphere Street. It was a 3,200 square metre warehouse, and as part of the development approval, it was required to provide 70 parking bays. Now, the majority of those bays were empty, and the developer, or the tenants, I should say, wanted to use some of those parking bays for container storage. So we undertook a detailed parking survey of the operations of that development and found that only 18 bays of the 70 bays provided on site were used by staff and visitors through the 2-week parking survey. So on average, 18 bays. So I believe approval was granted. I think the city required at least 25 bays to remain available for light vehicles, and the rest of the bays are currently more or less being used for container storage to actually expand. So essentially that's expanded the floor space of the warehouse by having all the sea containers in the car park. And granted, the car park was located behind a lock gate out the back of the warehouse. But that's an example, just one example, obviously, but an example of where the parking requirements, the statutory parking requirements for a warehouse of that size well and truly exceeded the actual operational needs for that particular business.
Can I just ask a secondary question that's directly related to the first question? Could you elaborate on that point and the relevance to this proposal, as the material I have before myself indicates, and the material that's been provided at today's meeting, there are no tenant and no assessment of tenant requirement or specific tenant requirement for each of the warehouses. So what should we be taking away from that analysis you provided us, that you talked about being a specific analysis of a operator on a specific site with specific needs? From the material I have here, there is not that information provided, and as clarified from today's discussion, will not be known till after construction. Could you elaborate the relevance of that variation that you referred to?
Yes, no, and I can certainly see that, and certainly from my perspective, it would be much more advantageous to have a known tenant where we can actually get actual data. But certainly from developments that we've worked on, large warehouse developments, anecdotally, we've seen a lot more automation appearing in warehouses, and actually the number of staff members dropping within warehouses. So for an industrial warehouse site, we feel that the estimated 9 to 10 staff per site is actually, quite a robust number in terms of an industrial warehouse type development. And many warehouses that have recently been approved in some of the outer suburbs have had closer to 1 parking bay per 400 metres being approved because of the level of automation that is now occurring in warehouses. So that's the basis from that experience. That's the basis that we've undertaken our assessment that warehouses are generally for storage, and the vast majority of a warehouse floor space is taken up by storage, shelving, parking of forklifts or other devices used to move materials around, and so the actual floor space available for staff and people to walk around is quite limited. And obviously floor space that has got boxes, containers, shelving on it is not generating parking needs.
Thank you. Thank you. I move back to Councillor Caroline Willinger. I interrupted you. Do you have any further questions at this juncture?
Yes, I'm wondering why the consultant has such differing views to the city officers about how much parking might be required and the experience with the city of Coburn.
Would you like me to answer that question?
Whoever wishes to answer the question from the consultant team, yes.
I'll answer that question. So in terms of the differing views, that there are, and I think that the West Australian Planning Commission's recently endorsed policy on non-residential car parking rates acknowledges this, that warehouses come in all different shapes and sizes. But as I'm sure the panel members have seen over the last few months in terms of the amount of warehouses that you've been assessing and in most cases, perhaps all cases, approving, the current parking standards of many local governments, if I could point to one, I look at the City of Swan, who have the same parking standard as the City of Armadale, yet they are also recommending approval to this panel for variations of greater than 70% to their parking requirements. I think there's been a few up in the Hazelmere and Wattle Grove locations of late. Those developments are getting approved with parking rates or shortfalls, I suppose, of similar to what we've got here, and even greater, in fact. And so I just think there's a bit of a the old parking standards for warehouses aren't matching up with what actually occurs in the modern day context with warehouses, and that's why you've got this WAPC policy on and it notes warehouses specifically as a use that does vary, and so therefore the parking provision should be done on a discretionary basis. And so I think that's where the difference is coming. I think that the city, I mean, our business is located in the Forestdale Business Park. So we are, and perhaps the city could speak to this further, but we're very well aware of any, the levels of parking that do occur in this estate as well as in others in the city of Armadale. And in the city officers have actually previously said to me that many of the development WA approvals that were granted in Forestdale when it was under their control didn't have conditions on them that limited the use of bays for storage. So in other words, prohibiting the use of bays for storage purposes. And so when I look out my office window, I do see actually, and this is a real thing, I see many businesses that do have sea containers, skip bins and the like in their bays, which is obviously displacing vehicles out onto the verge. And so I think that the city perhaps sees that and then is concerned about parking issues more broadly. And so they might take a cautious issue to that, but I'm sure the city can speak to that further. But hopefully that sets a bit of the context as to where the difference might lie. But in essence, warehouses do vary significantly in the types of tenants that they have. Our client has undertaken significant commercial research to the level that they're very confident that there's enough parking to support the tenants that they're seeking for this development. That's just the reality. And so I'd encourage the panel members to adopt an approach based on allowing this variation because of the circumstances we've presented to you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from panel members? Caroline, is there a continued question?
Sorry, Chair. If we are able to respond to that question, it was asked at both parties.
City officers, you'd like to make a comment at this juncture?
Yes, and I suppose we'd also like the opportunity to respond to some of the comments that have been made. It's probably
we will definitely have an opportunity for you to present at the completion of the general questions to the applicant, and then we were going to hand to yourself, as is the normal course, for you to provide any comments you wish. Would you like to provide a specific comment at this juncture, or would you like to wait till a little bit later?
We can wait if you'd like to do it that way.
Thank you. It's up to you whether it's convenient or otherwise.
No, I've done it. I've got a coordinated response, so I'll do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Panel members, is there any further questions? And I'll be specific at this point to applicant presentations. Panel members, you can always come back to questions. We will now move to officers at the City of Armadale. I have listed here that there's Catherine Sullivan and Paul Sanders. Is that correct in the room?
That's correct.
Yeah, great. I'll hand over to yourselves for presentation that you'd like to make in response to both the RA, the additional material and any comments that you've heard today. Handing over to yourselves.
So there's a few points we'd like to clarify, and I suppose what we used to is we approve about 99% of our development applications, and it's unusual to not reach agreement on an outcome, and in part I think it's got to do with the lack of detail associated with the actual uses that are proposed, and quite often we'll come to a reasonable conclusion through a process. This site is actually unique. There isn't actually a lot of street parking available because of Alexwood Drive, which won't allow any parking, and then the roundabout, and then the bends. So the options for street parking is fairly limited, and when we look at industrial developments, we do take into account the options of street parking, where else you can park, and businesses, and how long they'll be there. So we've had a long-standing principle. There was a claim made by Mr. Lambie that we hadn't reviewed the parking standards since 2005. He's actually referring to our town planning scheme, which has been reviewed a number of times, and in particular the parking standards that have actually been reviewed multiple times, most recently in the last 2 or 3 years, and as part of the normalisation of the Forestdale Business Park. So I'm not sure where he got his information from. And we actually went around and had a look at businesses and how they were operating, what sort of parking demand we had, and we looked at the actual uses that we were experiencing. So for us, we believe the parking shortfall is substantial. We're looking at modifying, and we would be allowing a variation, but not to the extent that is sought. The other thing that sort of come through our assessment of the development application and the subdivision is just the coordination of the two. So, for instance, the drainage designs the applicant has submitted as part of the engineering drawings actually show drainage swales where they've got crossovers. There's just this lack of coordination that's occurring between the designs of the development application and the engineering drawings and how they fit together. And that sort of comes across in terms of, the extension of footpaths and landscaping strips and the widths. So the plan doesn't actually have widths of landscaping on it, but it's pretty clear where the pinch points are, where they're below 3 metres, because they're actually narrower than the parking bays, and you can see that. In terms of the building facades and treatments, we believe those things can be resolved. We'd be looking for the applicant to have a much more positive approach to the treatments that should occur. Alex Wood Drive is the local distributor in the area. It's a major part of the branding of the area, and to have a very large blank wall a few metres off it at height just doesn't seem to make sense with limited treatments. Mr. Lambie also mentioned the bus routes. What probably isn't known is that those bus routes are temporary bus routes whilst the Armadale line is actually closed. And the frequencies of those bus services will actually move back to a more sparse arrangement, which obviously we as a local government aren't that supportive of, but PTA have been very firm, and we understand that the volumes of people using those bus routes don't justify those high frequency bus routes. So they'll finish actually mid-year if the Armadale line is open there in time. So what they did as part of the Byford Rail extension project, which I was involved in, is they actually modelled the distances and the bus service to the city, and they also modelled it to Coburn Central, and that's why we've actually got the east-west movement of that new bus route. So, the limited public transport available is really an issue. I suppose one of the things that comes up is when you're looking at warehouses come in all sorts of sizes and scales, and it really is around the operator and how much office space and how much of a distribution network they have and how much they actually turn over their materials. And the very large warehouse sites generally have very large discretion on the parking based on operational needs, and that's not unusual. It's the smaller warehouses that cause some of the difficulties for us. So we have a lot of knowledge and experience in looking at industrial areas, and as they go from an initial process through to a maturity, and as businesses expand, and how they actually work. So we do have a lot of parking problems in our established industrial areas, and there's not a lot of solutions available other than causing congestion. So on this particular site, the parking congestion, we'd be concerned about its impact on pedestrians and actually vehicle movements up and down Alex Wood Drives and around those crossovers, and what that means, because it would be quite dangerous. We do believe there's options around to increase the parking bays and resolve that. So we'd want to work with the applicant on a realistic number, and then obviously get some approved plans done. That was it. Thanks. Unless you had any inquiries.
Thank you. We will go to questions, but I do have a first question to you. You did, Paul, thank you for that. You did elaborate, we did make some comment about local context. Can you further elaborate on local context? Specifically, you referred to it as being quite specific or quite unique, and you've talked about the bus routes, but I understand from the material I have in relation to what's surrounding it, particularly in relation to ability for parking within the network. Could you just elaborate a little bit further on that, please?
So essentially, Alex Wood Drive has a medium in it with a drainage swale in it, and obviously you've got the roundabout there, and the verges aren't actually that wide, so there's no ability to park in those roads. You can't park in the carriageway essentially, and you can't park in the verge of Alex Wood Drive. So there is actually a height difference as well. And around roundabouts, as you probably know, there's the safe distance where you can't park in the lead up to a roundabout, and particularly around street parking. The verge in front of the development on the engineering drawings that are submitted is actually shown as a drainage swale, so that wouldn't actually allow parking on top of that. Obviously, they can actually put the drainage somewhere else, but obviously the land is designed to drain in that direction from west to east. In terms of the parking bays up the north-south road, I'll call it, the new road that's to be constructed, we're comfortable with 11 bays there, and that's obviously one of the solutions to the parking is maximising the amount of on-street bays that you can get.
Thank you. Panel members, are there questions to city officers?
Mate.
We'll first go to Councillor Michael Hancock and then we'll go over to Member Mike Moritz.
Thank you, presiding member. Yeah, I just have a question around what other uses could potentially be used on the site. So obviously the developer doesn't know who the tenants will be. So there is the possibility that they could secure tenants that might want to change the use to something perhaps a bit more intensive. I'm just wondering what other uses could potentially operate from the site and whether those uses could generate a greater parking requirement than what the warehouse does, let alone the reduction in parking that's being sought.
So the warehouse and storage car parking requirements are generally the lowest requirement. Anything that could be changed within the town planning scheme, there's various different types of uses. We find quite often things like private recreation try and go into spaces. They have a much higher car parking requirement. So we're starting at the lowest point. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be lower, have a lower requirement. Everything would be higher.
And I suppose what I might add is just the local context, which is there's a Hungry Jack's, there's a service station and a car wash just south of this site, just south of the road, and it is on close to Armadale Road and Alexwood Drive. And I suppose when I saw the development, I was a little bit surprised I saw warehousing, because warehousing is usually back of house in industrial areas. And I looked at the development and thought to myself, actually, it's a logical one that would up spec to a mixed use or something like that, or partial retail sales with something occurring, given its prominent location in this estate. Basically on the first roundabout. So, we would support those uses, and obviously what we're trying to do is manage the impacts of those uses.
Thank you. Is there an additional question there from Councillor Mike Hancock? No, we'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you very much, remember. To the officers, I was just interested in your description earlier around the sort of the empirical evidence of what's going on in similar sorts of industrial sites. You skipped over that you've done quite a bit of survey, and I sort of note that the applicant and their consultants have based their argument on a range of different standards and different examples. But I wondered what sort of empirical evidence beyond just sort of observation, whether you've actually done any surveys or any other detailed work, and just your experience to substantiate your argument with respect to the need for the more parking.
So essentially, we obviously have multiple industrial areas, and we have a lot of experience in the uses that are there and the concerns around parking standards, right through from lawn mowing businesses right up to manufacturing businesses. So we do have a good understanding how these businesses initially start quite small and then they grow over time on site. And sometimes they eventually get to a scale where they move, but quite often they stay in their current location for a long time. And the growth in the employee numbers that actually occur. So we have, the South Armadale industrial, Kelmscott industrial area, both, 30 years old plus, with all that changeover and rejuvenation that occurs in industrial areas. We also have the Vardy industrial area, which is a very broad scale industrial area, probably about 60% of the size of Canning Vale, but we've only done a couple of development approvals there, and we understand that one will have a different parking need than these smaller sites. So Forestdale Business Park East and West, we've been dealing and monitoring for a while. In terms of other local governments, when we're doing our review of our design guidelines for industrial development, particularly focusing on landscaping, but actually as part of that, the impact on parking. We went out to a number of industrial areas, including River Lake Industrial Area, which has been quoted as the Coburn standard. And anybody who drives around that will see that the parking in there for a new industrial estate is really, really problematic. It's actually got the parking problems of a mature estate. And that's what we're trying to avoid, where safety issues, landscaping, all those things are compromised because we haven't got the initial design right. So with this particular estate, it has, as part of the original designs, they went for a lot of swales in road reserves, which actually limits parking opportunities in the future, and mediums, which with drainage in it, which actually means you can't actually park in the street. That was the original design that the Armadale Redevelopment Authority did, based on some work they did in the early 2000s. And I think if we had our time again, we'd try to avoid some of those design issues, because as an area matures, it naturally needs more parking. It'd be great if everybody caught the bus there, but that's not really what happens. And there's no real residential areas around it, so people can't even sort of walk there.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions to the city officers?
Thank you, Presiding Member. If there is a future proposal to upscale, as you suggested may occur, whether it is through the detailed design process for this or whether it is a future tenant, if there's a future proposal to upscale to a more intense use with the retail component, would this require further approval?
Just let me have a quick look. Just 1 second, please. Sorry about that. I've not got enough windows open. Essentially, this site has a split zoning, so it's a bit generic, but there's industrial business and general industry zoning sits across this site. Some uses are discretionary, some are permitted. The difficulty is that the town planning scheme regulations don't allow you to address car parking for a permitted use. So it stays as a permitted use, and we don't get to sort of consider certain elements at that point. And as Paul was referencing previously, we know there are issues in certain areas, and car parking is not something that we can address retrospectively if it's a permitted use.
Okay. Second question, if you don't mind, is the requirement for adherence to a sustainability statement and some of the specific sustainability suggestions made by the design reference panel underpinned by policy, or is it mandated or required anywhere in your planning framework? So I guess what I'm saying is some of the suggestions made by the design reference panel in relation to sustainability, are those underpinned, those specific issues they've raised by policy somewhere? And if they provide a sustainability statement or not, is that enough basis to refuse an application on that issue?
Thanks for the question. Essentially, the city was awaiting the department to come up with consistent industrial design guidelines. Unfortunately, they decided not to do that. So we don't have any specific requirements. We do have a policy which encourages people to do things. So obviously, and we have our Switch Your Thinking program, and we have programs that actually support business, and for instance, solar panels and all those elements. But in terms of a policy standard where it specifies you have to do those things, there isn't one. We have ones that encourage those those mechanisms, and really what we're trying to do, which is consistent with, I suppose, what a lot of people in the industry like local government to do, is come up with a consistent approach to sustainability type elements. So someone can build a warehouse in one local government in terms of sustainability, and it applies somewhere else.
Great, thank you. That's all, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this juncture from panel members? Yes, Councillor Michael Hancock.
Thank you, Presiding Member. Probably just a follow up to the question just asked. Is the lack of sustainability information provided in the application forming part of the reasons for refusal? My understanding is the reasons are in relation to parking, design and landscaping. Could you just clarify that for me, please?
No, we haven't recommended refusal because of the sustainability elements, because they're not mandated, they're encouraged.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? I have a question to the officers. If you could please elaborate on your earlier comments about the merits of the proposal. You made a reference in your presentation principally around concerns for parking, and you indicated that you believe there was opportunities to work for a solution on those. Could you elaborate a little bit further on those comments? My read of that is that you're indicating that there is a solution in your mind, and I'm cognizant of the applicant's comments on not wishing to change the scale of the building.
So I suppose there's several ways we address shortfalls, and sometimes the shortfall can be quite small. Say, for instance, they were 3 bays short per unit. We might allow them to mark 3 bays within the building to make up that shortfall. So if there is a parking problem, they park their trucks inside overnight and things like that. We would look at the, I suppose, the rear servicing lane as well. It is very, very wide compared to other lanes, and there are different ways that trucks can manoeuvre in and out of these sort of areas, and it's very common to have much smaller service areas. And if you look at supermarkets, they have very large trucks as well. They don't have anywhere near that sort of crossovers or driveway manoeuvre areas. So we believe there could be some efficiencies we can talk to them about there, and obviously some efficiencies in the front. They've got the swale they need to resolve as well in the front road reserve, and it may be that needs to move. So then maybe we can look at some on-street parking there, and actually whether there's the opportunity to combine crossovers or anything like that to actually create additional parking on site. So we would also like to get a better understanding as, you know, in terms of the likely tenants and whether we can match those tenants to what parking requirements we can provide. And we sort of have had mixed sort of feedback on what is understood the tenants may be, and obviously the applicant can let us know as that develops. They may have specific tenants in mind as it comes forward, and you know, sometimes they don't want to disclose it in early stages.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from panel members? There are no further questions. We move back to the agenda. There is a recommendation at the beginning of the agenda. There's an alternate recommendation at the end of the agenda, and there's been an R13 recommendation for deferral. As per the standing orders, we will move to the recommendation that is at the beginning of the item. So recommendation for refusal. Is there a mover of the RA recommendation? It is moved by Councillor Michael Hancock. Is there a seconder for the RA recommendation? It is seconded. Councillor Caroline Weilinger. Would the mover like to speak to the recommendation for refusal?
Yes, thank you, Presiding Member. Look, initially came into this meeting wanting to support the Regulation 13 deferral. However, based on the comments from the applicant that they don't necessarily see a pathway forward through a deferral to resolve the city's concerns relating to parking, I would think that a decision one way or the other would probably be better for the applicant to move forward with an appeal if that's what they choose to do so. So in that regard, I'll be looking to obviously move the report's recommendation. However, I would also be comfortable with a deferral if the refusal is lost. I guess I would like to see further development in this industrial area. It's great to see it, taking off and really starting to build out. But it's also important to consider the impacts of development on the growth of the area, the sustainability of the area from an attractive place to do business, and areas that get chock full of people street parking illegally aren't pleasant to visit, and they can be detrimental to the overall area. So I think it's definitely an opportunity to improve the development, but based on what the applicant has sort of indicated in this meeting, deferring is probably not going to be productive, and perhaps is not the best use of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Would the seconder like to speak to the motion?
Only that I have also the same concerns as outlined. They are quite fluid with the footprint. They're very fluid with the parking, and the tenant is unknown. So there's a lot of concerns, I think, with this development.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers for the motion against the motion? Would you like to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Presiding Member. I will not be supporting the recommendation for refusal. I was initially considering the deferral, but based on some of the additional information and explanation provided today, if the motion for refusal is lost, I'll support the alternate recommendation for approval. I feel the proposed use, I guess, is consistent with the objectives of the industrial business and general industry zones. based on the information provided, I think in the additional information that was provided, it appears the applicant has responded to most of the reasonable issues raised by the city and its design review panel. I am mindful that in some industrial areas, particularly light industrial areas, in some other areas, there are issues with parking demand exceeding supply. And I think this should ideally be taken into consideration at early stage and not left to the local government to try and address 5 years down the track. But in this case, it does seem that there's been some solid benchmarking and rationale for the reduced parking provision. And I don't think that it's appropriate to require the provision of all parking required by the scheme for a development like this, when there are examples of development in the vicinity who have been approved with less. While I feel it would be ideal for all design issues to be resolved before the DAP makes its decision, I do note the applicant's comments that some of this will be refined before a building application is lodged, and there are conditions to ensure this happens. I also feel that some of the design and sustainability issues raised are probably a high bar to achieve for a development of this nature. And I'm not saying that we should be lax in requiring high quality design for warehouses. I'm definitely not saying that at all. But I do think when you step through each of the issues raised by the design review panel, I think some of the issues raised may not be entirely reasonable or appropriate in this instance. So if the motion for refusal is lost, I will be supporting the alternate recommendation for approval with a couple of tweaks to a couple of the conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers on the motion? I will speak to the motion. I have some mixed concerns in relation to this development. I am comfortable that, as been commented by the officers, that issues relating to some of the matters such as landscaping can be resolved via conditions subject for further discussion. I'm not confident, based on the material that we've been provided today, including the comments from the city officers, that parking has satisfactorily been resolved on this site, in this location, and there's been some detail provided regarding this location, and that leaving those matters to a later date is questionable from my perspective. I am satisfied that city officers have indicated that they believe there are options for discussion, and whilst I wouldn't support a refusal at this point, I think it's reasonable that a deferral would provide the opportunity for applicant and city officers to, one, look at the parking and the ability for parking on the site, additional parking on the site. I will not specify a number, but it also provides an opportunity to refine both the land use, get some clarity around that. And the applicant has indicated today that they have no information on the tenant either, and they're not expecting to have that information on the tenant till after construction. And so matters relating to type and nature of tenancy is not a matter that really I can bring into consideration. In addition, in relation to parking, the opportunity for the city officers through the RA as well to provide information about, and we've heard a lot today about parking variation on a number of estates. I am interested from information from the city in relation to this, and I have already expressed a view that the city have indicated there is some uniqueness around this new estate, and so I think that's important that also be brought into consideration. And the final matter in relation to parking is there's been a series of analysis provided. It was touched on by applicant, city officers as well as members, that there are some different ratios used to calculate parking to substantiate it on this particular site, on this particular location, of this scale of and size of unit. We did speak about a much larger unit with a single occupant. And so from my perspective, there is some further information that I would consider appropriate in relation to this parking analysis. And I cite the comments that have been provided by the applicant in relation to particular studies and comments by officers relating to local government studies. So I'd like a more composite position on that information, particularly as it relates to the relevance of this site and those reasons that I've given. So whilst I say there is some merit, and I accept the comments provided by the mover and the seconder, the city officers in their final comments have elaborated that there is some opportunity that wouldn't necessarily substantially alter the necessarily the scale of the build, but there are opportunities based on the site configuration and design. And it's for those reasons that I don't support in this juncture either a final determination of refusal or approval, but I am favouring an option of deferral for the reasons that I've given. As indicated, there are some strong positive merits for this proposal, but at this juncture, there are some issues, particularly around parking, that I feel require further clarification. Those are my comments. Are there any further speakers on the motion? If there are no further speakers, we move back to the mover for right of reply and close off debate.
Thank you, Presiding Member. I have no further comments to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are going to the vote for recommendation for refusal. All those in favour? Against? It is lost for the minute taker. Did you get the vote? Thank you. Lost 2-3. We are now going to an alternative motion. Does any member wish to put an alternative motion? Or I will put an alternate motion. It's not a procedural motion, it is an alternate motion, and that is important for a deferral. So I will move, I'm going to move deferral for those reasons that I cited. It's been moved for a deferral for a period of up to, I will say, 90 days to provide further information on particularly parking, additional parking opportunities on the site, information about parking requirements and issues associated with the unique location, and further information regarding the parking standards relevant to this. And there's been some significant commentary made around that matter, as well as further information in relation to clarification of occupant and whether or not there's any further information on occupant that will provide clarity associated with the parking requirements for that site. If there is a seconder, I will speak to that motion. It is seconded, Mike Moretz. I have spoken extensively already about my rationale. From my perspective, there is a lot of merit for the proposal, but I'm not comfortable at this stage that the on-site parking in a new estate based on a significant number of variables that it is warranted. And therefore, I think it's appropriate that additional time be provided in order to have this material, from my perspective, for me to make a determination. I will just clarify the motion enables all members to speak as it is a regular motion. Would the seconder like to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Presiding. So I'm keen to support the deferral because my sense of the application is that it's not fully mature. All of the issues haven't been worked through to a sensible resolution between the applicant and the local authority. So I'm happy to see the deferral proceed so that the matters that have been discussed can be worked through, hopefully to a sensible resolution.
Any further speakers on the motion? If there are no further speakers, we are going immediately to the vote. As the mover, I have no further comments and therefore right of reply has essentially been had. We are going to the vote on the deferred motion for a period of up to 90 days for the reasons that I have outlined. All those in favour? Against? It is carried 4-1. I move back to the agenda. There are no Form 2 applications for today's agenda and no SAT matters for today's agenda. We have listed in the agenda the SAT applications and Supreme Court appeals. I have no comments from those. They are listed, and I will close the meeting at 10:54 a.m. Thank you for your participation.